From the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona, this is Politics and the Past with Robert Ferguson. If you listened to our last couple of episodes, you would know that we're changing things up here a little bit at Politics and the Past. We are launching a new schedule where we're doing 2 episodes a week. On our Monday episodes, we are showcasing leading edge research in political subjects, both at Arizona State and around the country. In fact, when we first launched this podcast, this was sort of what we hoped to do. And I think we've done a pretty good job of it so far. But we've also found that there's been an opportunity to showcase some of our young stars at Arizona State University in the Politics and Leadership Club. So we wanted to give them a chance to shine, maybe talking about more contemporary political issues. So our Thursday episodes are going to be more along the lines of those contemporary political issues and showcasing some of our young talent here at the Center for American Institutions. On Mondays, however, again, we are going to be emphasizing and highlighting leading edge research. And what we are talking about today is absolutely leading edge research. My guests, Dale Justice and Frank Mons, are in the over in the political science department here at Arizona State University, and they are launching something called the State of Veterans Project. If you're somebody who knows a veteran, who is a veteran yourself, or is interested and engaged in veteran policy, this is a must listen. What they will present today is very surprising and also very interesting and something that I think all of our listeners will enjoy, but particularly if you are somebody who is interested in veterans policy. Anyway, without further ado, let me leave you to the conversation with Dale Justice and Frank Mons. Okay. Well, we have with us today Dale Justice and Frank Mons, who are over in SBGS at Arizona State University, and they've done some fascinating research on veterans' political preferences, on the political preferences of veterans and their propensity for extremism. And I think that they are going to explain not only where they came up with this, but maybe push back on some popular notions on how veterans' political preferences are typically portrayed both in media and maybe in academia as well. Dale and Frank, are you able to tell us a little bit about yourselves? Dale, I'll start with you.
Yeah. Well, Rob, again, thanks for having us. My name's Dale Justice. I'm a PhD student here at Arizona State, a political scientist and a United States Marine Corps veteran. My research focuses pretty much on the degradation of American democracy, especially how conspiratorial thinking, declining trust in our courts, and gaps in veteran policy tend to shape political behavior. I am one of the co-leaders out of our State of Veterans Initiative. It's a national effort out of ASU's School of Politics and Global Studies, and we partnered with Clapper, which is the Center for Latinos Politics and Research. Our mission is to build the first comprehensive data set on veterans' experiences and political attitudes, and our work aims to essentially just pinpoint where our institutions are weakening and how we can strengthen them for the future and for the betterment of America's finest.
Frank?
I'm Frank Mons. I actually recently graduated with a master's at ASU's School of Political Science and Global Studies, and I am also on the team for our State of Veterans Project, doing a lot of the behind the scenes data and statistics work. And then
You're
I'm also a veteran myself. I was in the Army for a few years.
excellent. Well, thank you, gentlemen, both for your service and for the work that you've compiled here, and that you'll be doing more work compiling more data Yeah, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
so you've talked a little bit about the State of Veterans Project. Are you able to explain a little bit more about it and what you hope to really, what you hope to accomplish?
Sure. Um, if you want, Frank, I'll kick that off, and then we'll turn over the data side of it to you. Originally, this started, at least for me, in my undergraduate pursuits, in which I was interested in the policy side of veterans. It seemed to me that the need of veterans weren't being met, and even though Congress has not only the duty but the obligations to hold the VA and other veteran organizations accountable um, for the treatment and the care of veterans. It seemed to me that in order to find the data in the first place to tell the story on the care of veterans was limited at best, at least made to the public. When I got to ASU as a um, PhD student, I met with Dr. Francisco Pedraza, who runs the Clapper uh, initiative here at ASU, and we sat down and discussed. He had this idea for a state of veterans, and essentially what it is before, when it came to the international work, uh, there wasn't once upon a time there wasn't a coalesced effort for academics to be able to pool their research. In comes the correlates of war, and this becomes a massive project in which um, scholars come together, they pool their data into one central place, and it helps tell a unified story. Uh, and the idea became, if there's nothing like this for veterans, why don't we fill the gap? And we decided maybe what we should do is, if we can't get this story told from government agencies, if we can't get these organizations to come to the table, then perhaps we tell the story as best we can to start. We begin to pool as much data as possible, get it into one central location, and understand that because we are limited on the amount of data we have, that this would then open up a spot at the table to have these organizations and have the VA, have the government come in and sit down and not only help fill in what we're missing, but if we're wrong, tell us that we're wrong. And this is where it's right. And give us access to um, better information to tell a much larger story for veterans. And so we launched the State of Veterans Initiative this semester, a couple months back. And since then, we've been able to get a couple universities on board with us. We've been able to reach out to some of the public third party veteran advocacy groups like the VFW and the like. And we've had a couple of the veteran centers across the country with universities coming forward wanting to help us. And what's interesting is we're finding out even they lack a lot of the data, which you would think they would need if they are running into uh, a support system in which they have to take care of their students too. And it became an even bigger story. So that's the point of the initiative, is to tell this much larger story. And it's only because the data is so scarce. And to speak of the data, I'll let Frank get in here because he's our data whiz. So
Yeah, and without getting, too much into the weeds here, but, as Dale kind of already stated, there's a huge gap in that veteran data, and so it's up to us to find avenues where it does exist in some small form. And so we've taken a few data sets now and looked at them, but the main one we're using, because of the sheer numbers of it, is the congressional election study. So the CES and the CCES, out of, I believe it's Harvard and Tufts, pulled that. And so we are able to collect data from, obviously, tons of civilians. We do have a decent number of veterans in there, and an even smaller proportion of current service members that we've been able to pull from. Um, so we have been able to pull some. some things and get some semblance of an idea of where veterans and current service members stand to their civilian counterparts. The issue that we're facing is that the civilian numbers, when you compare a handful of years, it's hundreds of thousands of people. And then you get into veterans and it's maybe 1,000, if that. And then you start stepping into the actual service members and you've got, maybe 100. And so obviously those numbers by comparison, it's kind of hard to make real big distinctions. So we do what we can with what we have for right now. But as Dale talked about, obviously our future push is to collect some of that data. Um, and not just for our own purposes and for future research, but also for these veteran organizations, as Dale mentioned as well. I remember we had a meeting with, and I don't know if it was one of the if it was the VFW or one of the other veterans orgs, but they had someone who was asking, how would we even collect the data on our members? How would we even get that out? How do we disseminate that to them? And so it became pretty noticeable to us that they weren't even really collecting necessarily um, statements of their members and who their members were, and anything, let alone anything beyond that. And so we would definitely like to get some of that information in the hands of these veteran organizations to help them better serve their veteran populations as well.
I mean, first of all, gentlemen, I mean, this sounds like a tremendous project and one that is very necessary. I must admit, listening to you, I feel a bit of dismay, in the sense that I would have, you in a couple of instances, you've alluded to the fact that you have these big organizations, whether they're universities, whether they're VFW, who you would hope have pretty good tabs on what's going on with their members. Whether it's, whether it's, in formats like data and, all these organizations that we're talking about. And I have this fear, and I don't want to make too many assumptions, but I have this fear that as, the state of veterans gets an opportunity to speak to even bigger organizations, whether it's the VA or with the federal government, you might come uncover the same truth that they themselves don't have very good data. And we're dealing with organizations that are allocating vast sums of resources.
The
Right.
unfortunate thing is Congress has, like I said, the duty and the responsibility for oversight. Um, it seems to me, there was an article called "Congressional Oversight Over Police Patrols versus Fire Alarms" in 1984. It's put out by Cubbins and Schwartz, and in it they talked about the role of oversight and what it tends to look like versus whether it's police patrol where it's the run of the mill every day we just we do oversight because that's our job versus fire alarm oversight in which we have a whistleblower, something's happened in which the spotlight is now on the organization. Congress is forced to take a serious look at it. Um, Lest we have some type of fire alarm oversight, it's apparent that just regular police patrolling isn't working. And because of that, this lack of data, um, it appears to me and to the team that the data should be collected and this should be something that's happening on the regular and is made public, but doesn't seem to be happening unless there's some type of whistleblowing situation, something that brings about a massive scope and a big spotlight to the VA. I don't know that anything changes otherwise. Now, I'm not advocating for something like that. What I am advocating for is a responsibility to the very backbone of American democracy in the first place. If we don't take care of our veterans, then there's no incentive for us to continue to have, um, military personnel who join in the active ranks anyway, when they can see what it looks like on the backside of it. And I believe we had moved forward, from this after, Vietnam, but it appears that as it appears we've become more stagnant with time, and that the American public perhaps might not know that this lack of data is happening in the first place. And if that's the case, then it's our hope and our prerogative that by telling these stories, even if the story's wrong, even if we get it wrong, that it would open up a place for those to come forward and say, you have it wrong here. Let us show you where it actually is. Let us show you what's actually right. And it gives us the opportunity to pull all of it back together and say, hey, let us correct this. But the reason why we would get it wrong is because it's not being provided in the first place. And so we've actually gone into this with the idea that we might get some of this wrong. And it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing because it then puts the spotlight on these organizations and essentially on Congress to say, you're not doing the job necessary to tell the story for those who need their stories told the most.
Right. Right. You'd love to not have to do this, you
Of course.
know?
Exactly.
Uh, right. And you put it, but it, the work you're doing allows you to put a story, or allows you to, to present data, to present a situation. And then, if it needs to be, if it deserves to be refuted, it forces the government, it will force these organizations to refute it and give them the reason why. And that would be a win for everybody.
Yes, I think that's the hope for all of us. Not everyone on the team are veterans,
Sure.
but everyone I think on the team knows a veteran.
Mhm.
And I think that's the majority of Americans when you have an absolute small subset of Americans who've taken that oath, it becomes, it's incumbent upon the rest of America to take care of those who provided the very, freedom in the first place. And if if they don't have the correct information, if they don't have, the knowledge that this is happening, then how can they ever be served in their best interest? So, um, to put it, I guess, in the lightest terms, we wanna just put a spotlight on this, show the world that, there's a gap here, and essentially open the door that and I'd like to make this known too, Rob. This is not just an ASU initiative. Yes, we launched it out of ASU, and yes, this is home base, but this is a call to action for any of your listeners and for anyone who might down the road have some type of interest in veteran policy and taking care of those who took care of you. Come on board. Come help us tell this story. There's room for you. There's room for everyone here. um, Veteran policy is much more than just picking up a rifle and doing war. It's much more than that. Um, Therefore, there's a massive uh, role for anyone and everyone who has something to add to this. So this could be anyone from being a veteran yourself all the way up to you're a political scientist yourself, perhaps you're an economist, perhaps you don't do any of that, you're just a secretary at a third party organization, perhaps you are an employer in which you hire a lot of veterans. I don't think it necessarily matters in that regard. What does matter is that we help those who helped us, and we tell this much bigger story. This is, make no mistake about it. This is a call to action. And the only way we can, you're right, Rob, this is a big undertaking. We recognize that it's a big undertaking, but anything worth doing is going to be challenging in the first place. And it has to be done because if not us, then who? And we ask everyone who might hear this and moving forward, please come on board, give us a hand. We welcome all the help. Let's get this story told.
Yeah. Okay, so let's dig into some of the data that you have collected and that you have analyzed. You've recently submitted a piece on veterans, on the propensity for veterans to embrace extremist politics or ideologies. Are you gentlemen able to give me maybe a broad overview of your research, and then maybe we can dig in a little bit deeper?
So our research again, we dug in using the CCES data. We were able to break down military connection by either veteran, civilian, or current service member. There are a couple other options in there. So we could have had like veteran family members and current service member family members as well. For this first paper, we didn't want to complicate things too much, so we kept it slim to just civilians and veterans and service members. Um, then we kind of had to find a way to operationalize the idea of extreme views. And so the CCES data we pulled from was from 2015 to 2024. So we had to go through and find like variables to be able to kind of answer some of these questions. So our operationalization of extremism ended up containing 4 parts, and then each of those parts had multiple questions and variables from the CCES that we put together. Those 4 parts included militarism, which were containing questions of military force and interventionism. Second was xenophobia, which was more questions about immigration restriction, specifically immigration restriction for certain types of people. Racism was our third part of that operationalization, which was the racial resentment and race-related policy questions. And then we had sexism kind of tying it in at the end with was gender role traditionalism and gender equality policy attitudes. And then we were able to pull together questions for each year and kind of get a year-to-year estimate of where everybody lined up in those 3 groups. And so year over year, and in our research, we do have a graph, which I'll send you if you want to post somewhere. But uh, in our research, we do see a lot of fluctuation year to year, but most of that can be explained by the fact that the questions changed year to year. And so it's not as much as like where those points go from year to year as it is where the groups lie, to each other in each of those years.
Right, and that's the purpose of what you're trying to decipher or discern, right? How veterans' attitudes differ from civilians' attitudes, or veterans' current service members and civilians differ from each other.
Correct. Correct. So we were able to pull those together over the years and get those comparisons done. And we did note that there were a handful of years where service members seemed to be the most extreme, are holding the most extreme views. Veterans seem to be typically coming in second, and in about half the years they were basically on the same exact point. Much of the difference, I think, can more be explained by the sheer numbers of our respondents. So in the civilian category, for a single year, we may have 45,000 respondents. But then as we drop down into the veteran category, we only have maybe 1,000. And then as we drop off into the current service member category, we might have just 100. And so I think a lot of that variation can mostly be explained in those numbers there. We are going to be putting together some more research to follow this up, which will dive into whether or not, that's the case. But right now, I think that it's pretty easy to say that it's pretty much online, that there doesn't seem to be a big difference between service members or veterans and their civilian counterparts, that we're pretty much in line.
Yeah, that seems to be I think the tremendous conclusion of the research is that veterans, contrary, I think, maybe to some public media out there, or to some aspects of public discourse that um, seem to fall maybe for simplistic ideas of veterans' political beliefs, want to lump them all together, or in some ways want to or make grand assumptions based again on very little data, maybe based on a few anecdotes, but not based on any data. What you have here is you basically show that from when it comes to politics, veterans don't differ very much from the rest of the population on political preferences. And, maybe that's a part of a consequence of a republic like the United States, where people from all backgrounds do end up joining the military, from all parts of the country and all backgrounds do end up enlisting or joining the military. Um, but that being said, there were a few distinctions. And do you want to maybe get into what maybe a couple of the distinctions were?
Yeah.
One thing I do want to note real quick, Frank, is that one thing that we did find wasn't necessarily, well, certainly was that about the extremism aspect, that it wasn't much different than the civilian population. But what we certainly did find was that veterans are very much capable of organizing. And that's very in line with what a veteran already is exposed to, with a very organized aspect of their lives being the US military in the first place.
Interesting. That's an interesting point. And is that um, a combination of maybe just existing network that is in place, combined with the fact that you know if you're in the military, your job is to organize. You know how to grow groups. You know how to yeah. Anyway, I'll let you go from there.
I believe so. I think that a good example is when we started this project. Frank and I had never met prior to it, and the moment that we realized, oh, you were in the army, oh, you were in the Marines, immediately we had a bond, and we were able to have something that equals out a good foundation for us to build a good friendship and a working relationship out of, and it's specifically because of um, that brotherhood that you build by taking the oath in the first place. So I believe that's a big part of it. And then the other thing is, when you're in the service, everything is compartmentalized, everything is organized, and it's all the way down to the most minute things that you can imagine, from when you can eat, when you can sleep, when you can speak, when you can move. Everything is dictated by schedule and by order. And when you have that discipline, it gives you the ability to organize with others who come from that type of background, to understand hierarchy, to understand um, what it means to work as a cohesive unit for an overall arching goal. I think that's the story, and we've seen this play out, right? We've seen organizations like Proud Boys, or um, uh, there are other veterans that is slipping my mind at the moment, forgive me. Oath Keepers being one, where organizations come together full of veterans, and you could take it as far back as, coming back from, the Korean War and Vietnam, when you see the rise of
I
motorcycle,
was gonna say the
gangs. Like,
red and white, right?
that's right, you can see this, throughout time, um, where being a veteran gives you an opportunity to create an organization and be effective in that organization. But serving in the military doesn't make you extremist by nature of what it is.
Interesting. Interesting. So it's one of those aspects where their views do not necessarily differ from the ordinary civilian population, but when it does differ, there are some important uh, considerations.
That's it.
Yep. Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. So, but on the views themselves, there tended to be, at least on what I can tell, racism, um, and militarism, particularly, virtually, almost indistinguishable from civilian attitudes. Correct?
Yeah, and just to give your listeners an idea here, service members for militarism, it was only 7.8% that were in the extreme militarism category, or extreme militarism views category, whereas veterans were 8% and civilians were 8.4%. So that's so close in line that we can basically, call that a wash.
Okay, I got a question. But what do you mean by extreme militarism? Sorry to be the semantic guy here.
Sure, yeah. So militarism, to start out with, was based on questions about how we should use the U.S. military, or how we should deal with a foreign adversary. And so some of those questions might have answers to them, which were like, we should bomb the country, or we should use full military force, send full military force and invade the country. And so those were obviously weighted as higher extreme views than, say, we should send aid to the people affected, or the other countries affected by these conflicts. And those conflicts obviously changed year to year as things were being dealt with. Sometimes we're talking about North Korea, sometimes we're talking about the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. And, so like obviously some of those things changed, but ultimately the answer choices were very much in line with, this is how we should deal with it. And there was very high, like, militaristic responses versus, we should stay out of it, which is much more pacifist way of looking at it. And so those were obviously scored negatively against that score.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. So what you found is that um, service members were about as likely to support a maximum military response to whatever the global security problem du jour was.
Yeah, yeah, and those numbers are right in line. If we can draw any conclusion from them, we can probably see that civilians are slightly more militaristic, and that may have to do with them not having experienced war, or not being in a position to, okay, well, if we do start a war, I'm going to be the one going overseas, in terms of the service members. And so if there is anything to be gleaned from that in those terms, I think it's more the lack of understanding and the willingness to send people overseas who aren't you and aren't people you know.
Sure. So this notion of service members sort of being Curtis LeMay, or
Right.
I'm trying to think of the character's name in Doctor Strangelove that George C. Scott plays, where he's advocating a forceful military response, and measuring it mega deaths.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
It it is not a fair characterization of most military service members. And I mean, I think that perfect make your conclusion there seems very logical to me, that if you're an active duty serviceman or you're a veteran, you know what it's like.
Right.
And many veterans are, of course, still enlisted in the reserves,
Correct.
right? So you're just because you're out doesn't mean you're out.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
And it's important to note too, Robert, that America has been involved in the Middle East for the last almost 20 years. Um, and yet you don't see that spike. And I think that I definitely want to go on the record for defense of veterans, because that certainly speaks to the demeanor, the character, and the ability to compartmentalize a job versus perhaps a political preference, or a personal preference. To be able to go into a job in which you have to look at the left and right of you and understand that there's a chance that one of these folks aren't coming back with you, and to still come home and understand that it was a job. I did what I had to do because my country called me to do it, and to not harbor ill will or feelings towards a specific group of people, especially when we look at our stats and xenophobia, to not harbor those types of feelings, um, I think is a tremendous story that needs to be told as well. That America's finest certainly come home, and while they carry that burden upon their own shoulders of the things that they had to do as a result and the cost of war, they tend to uh, not reflect that in their views on the rest of the world.
Yeah. Yeah, well, let's dig into the xenophobia statistics then. What did you guys find with xenophobia? And again, if you guys wouldn't mind explain like how you describe it, or like how you define it for the purposes of the study.
Yeah. So, again, xenophobia was lined up with questions specifically pertaining to, what should we do with immigrants? And so there are questions on legal immigration, there are questions on illegal immigration, and then from there, within those answer choices, it's kind of similar to militarism, where it's a more extreme view, maybe to um, uh, a more extreme view might be to completely kick out an entire group of people
Right.
who are already here in America. A more extreme view might be limiting people coming in from specific countries, and those would be rated higher in terms of xenophobia. And then when we did get those numbers, this is probably one of the biggest differences, honestly, between the groups. And again, as I spoke about earlier, some of that can probably be uh, relegated to just the sheer numbers of civilians versus the other.
Sure, there's a sample size problem across all of them.
Right. But we do see a huge difference, whereas the bottom of that group is service members at 14%, and the highest is veterans at 25%. So we do see some fairly extreme differences here comparatively to the other variables.
Right. And that is really interesting that you see current service members with very low propensity for is extreme view on it, and veterans with a very high one. Now, and again, this is where the data, I think, again, there's limitations here. You mentioned a couple. One of the things that I think about is veteran. You could be a 23-year-old veteran and a 93-year-old veteran.
Exactly.
So that does make it definitely makes it difficult to see what.
And that will be one thing that we're going to be diving into in future research papers. Obviously, we wanted to keep this one somewhat basic as a starting off point. But I believe our next paper will be going into other demographics and seeing if there's any correlation between those that might appear stronger than veteran, service member, civilian.
Yeah.
You can also be a veteran who went to theater, and you can be a veteran who never left stateside.
Yeah.
Yep, very true.
Absolutely. I mean, and one of the other things that I think, when we are looking at current service members, there's a lot of first generation Americans
Yes.
that are current service members.
Correct.
And so I expect to some degree there's a little bit of that that is affecting the current service members' preferences. I mean, I'm always amazed whenever I see a group of active duty servicemen, and I'm always amazed at how diverse it is.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's getting more and more diverse. One of the cool things, I guess, from the VA is their vet pop study, which unfortunately they don't make the data public for us to kind of look through that ourselves. But they do have graphics up and some of their numbers up, and we can see that's really kind of been the case, that change.
Mhm. Okay. So but what might you attribute the higher numbers among veterans, and the veterans exceed civilians?
Yes, the veterans exceed civilians by about 5%.
Right.
I think it's like just under 21% is where the civilians sit. So yeah, that 5 point difference. Again, obviously we've got some confounding things there, but I think if anything, maybe it's the idea of others. And that can be kind of a double-edged sword. So, as Dale talked about, you've got veterans who served overseas and veterans who stayed home. So veterans who served overseas may see it as okay, I went through all this traumatic stuff in this other country, and I'm kind of would be glad to not see any people from that part of the world over here. You may have people, who never saw combat, who stayed here in the U.S. and are veterans, and may see it as well, that they were those others over there that we were fighting against. So obviously they must be the bad guy, or something along those lines. There's so many different ways that can be chopped up and viewed, that it's hard to make a good judgment, I think, on those numbers and where exactly they're coming from. I feel like it was somewhat of a surprise, especially seeing the difference between veterans to service members there.
Dale?
Yeah, the other part that I found interesting is it kind of piggybacks off what you were saying a little bit ago, Robert, about you have 90-year-old veterans versus 24-year-old veterans. The enemies that they fought along the way were different too. Different regions of the earth. Uh, and one of the things that we had talked about in wanting to pursue this even further was, um, does it translate across generations and across different enemy combatants? For that exact reason. Do the Will we see an alignment in the data between veterans who fought during World War II and faced Germans versus or the Japanese versus veterans who are serving now or who had previously served recently and getting out now, and their are I guess their outlook on folks from the Middle East, and what that looks like. We'd be really interested to see if there's a correlation here, uh, but I don't know. Again, one thing leads to another. One question begets another, and it just turns into this massive snowball effort in which we realize, by proposing one question and going to answer it, it has led us to 100 more. And while that's a great thing for us, it's also a large undertaking. And but it's exciting because for the first time we feel like this data is actually starting to come ahead and we're able to look and get into the deep nuances. Um, and given recent events like January 6th, we've thought about, the data before we got into this kind of was lining up about the same as what we had already found. When we were doing our literature reviews, we were finding that a lot of this information was lining up exactly with what we had already um, found. But then we started thinking, well, has there been another situation like a January 6th? Has there been anything in which we've seen a concerted effort, um, like what was witnessed on January 6th, and so we thought, "Hey, there's a good chance that this data has now changed," and so when we proposed this original idea, we were kind of excited to see, has the temperament changed? Has the last 20 years of, OIF, OEF, and the continued efforts in the Middle East, has it changed the data? Has it changed the outlook of America's veterans? And, to our surprise, it hadn't. Um but what it did do is, like I said, it pointed out a lot of other gaps that we're excited to then go forward and fill and ask deeper questions, deep dive even further on what does it mean to even be a veteran? The differences in being a combat veteran versus a stateside veteran, the different uh, enemy combatants that they faced. Does any of this play a deeper role? We're excited to find that out.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. I'm gonna offer my one possible perspective on the veteran xenophobia thing. Just that, and this builds on what you've been talking about quite a bit, which is the fact that veterans organizations appear to, at first glance, not have as much data in order to be able to make good resource allocation decisions, meaning that aid, support for veterans, which often comes from the government for good reason, is either not reaching the people it needs to be reached, maybe not accomplishing what it's set out to accomplish, and maybe not meeting the expectations of veterans. And to somebody who's in that position, um, an, immi- an immigrant appears a competition for those resources. An immigrant who did not serve the country, who did not make the same type of sacrifice that they made.
That's a really good point.
Yeah. I
Um,
know the VFW is private and nonprofit, and they've collected their own data uh, through time, and it's had to be an effort in which um, they've served the needs of veterans where it seems the VA perhaps has fallen short for those veterans that they've taken care of, and it's also operated as a place for like-minded and shared experienced folks to meet and have that support group. being that they're private and nonprofit, I would venture to say that uh, a lot more could be done if they had more access to funds. When you have to, you're fundraising with fish fries and bingos and raffles, you can only go so far to serve a need of a much larger group. Again, to the point I was making earlier, uh, that perhaps the general public does not know that this issue exists in the first place. And one other thing I wanted to note too was while we were having this conversation, it kind of dawned on me that I served from '06 to 2010, and I recalled serving with a few folks who were on a program um, to receive naturalization through service,
Mhm.
which is a program I'd also like to note has since been suspended, I believe, as of
Very recent.
2020, I think. And don't please don't quote me on that. I believe that it changed in 2020, but um, the idea that you used to be able to join the service in pursuit of naturalization and becoming an American citizen, you weren't automatically granted, but the pathway was a heck of a lot easier without the stumbling blocks that most immigrants seem to face as they come in. Um, so that was something else that perhaps Frank and I can begin to look at is how does that play into it when you have to serve for the needs of becoming naturalized?
I do know. I did quickly check here. There it is still in place. Some form of it is still in place.
Yeah, I
Naturalization
think that
service.
they had, I believe it was President Biden that had brought in a new program, but as far as I knew, it was like MAVNI or there's an acronym for it, but that had come to an end.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, and okay, so the other place that there's maybe a slightly different perspective between veterans, current service members, and citizens was on gender. Do we care to dig into that for finish? We'll finish off with we'll finish off with that in the data, and then we'll summarize the whole thing. We'll start. We'll go through that.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah. So, in what we called combined sexism, um, which were again questions on gender roles, uh, social programs based on gender, stuff like that. Um, we saw basically even scores for civilians and veterans at 7.4% and 7.9% respectively. Where we saw the biggest difference was in service members at over 15%, which is more than or just about a twice as much as the other two groups.
So how would you define an extreme gender perspective here?
An extreme gender perspective would be um, limiting views on women's rights. So, um, obviously, as we've already discussed, each year has kind of different questions, but on a handful of the years, there were discussions based on taking away a woman's right to vote. And so obviously that would be seen as an extreme view to take someone's right to vote away. Something else may be extreme views on abortion. So as far as completely banning, as opposed to having, some exceptions to that, would be looked at as a more extreme view. And so that's how we operationalize that one.
Okay. Okay. And yeah, you saw you saw some pretty. So you saw some. Sorry, can you go over those numbers again?
Yeah, yeah. So we were 7.4% for civilians, 7.9% for veterans, and 15.3% for service members. So quite a big difference over the other two groups in the service members.
I mean, I think off the top of my head, I think that when you're a current service member and you are whether you're deployed or whether you're not deployed, you're in a pretty highly masculine environment.
Yeah, not only a masculine environment, but I would also argue that most service member on the younger side for age as well.
Mhm.
Obviously, we have tons of current service members who are holding those officer and non-commissioned officer positions who are in other age groups, but the vast majority of military members are probably between 18 and 25 years old.
Mhm. Right. And I mean, in the end, they're it's a selective service. would probably adds a certain dimension here. Maybe creates a certain level of hostility.
Yeah. Yeah, completely selective service. I mean, there's just gender roles within the military that we've also recently seen changed. And by recent, I mean in past decades and over the last few years in some of these cases. But we've seen infantry roles able to be opened up to women. We've seen special operations roles now open to women that were never open to them before. And so I think for sure, as the military and service members get used to seeing women in those roles and kind of adjust to that, there's going to be some pushback. Not
Seeing them succeed in those roles, I think, is important.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And we've seen that be the case too. We haven't seen a big issue of, okay, well, everyone was worried that they weren't going to be able to do the job. That hasn't been what we've seen. They've been able to do basically any job that I've looked into, at least, just as well as their male counterparts. So again, it's more, I think, just the uncomfortableness of it, of the, okay, this is always a man's job, and now I'm in here and it's being, mixing with women. And then you've already got this hyper masculine, environment. You've got a younger demographic of people typically in the service currently. So I think all of those are compounding features of that, and kind of why we see that number be a lot higher there.
Dale?
Yeah, I was gonna add on that in 2016, I believe, under Secretary Carter, the MOS specialties became open to all women. So it gave the avenue for women to now serve in a combat role on front lines. Um, I would be interested to see as we move forward to test. Um, is it based on that? I do believe that innately, that a lot of male veterans tend to uh, be concerned over the idea of having um, uh, women serve in a position in which uh, there's this idea of being a protection, like a protector, if you will. And when you put yourself in a position, does that change the outlook? I don't know that it does. In 2016, the Marine Corps attempted to seek an exemption for that, and they were denied. And since then, to Frank's point, we've seen women be able to walk into these roles and execute just as well as men can. Um, and I don't know that that is the overarching story here, as to why you may or may not see an increase, but it would be worth testing, especially given prior to 2016 and after, looking at the data and seeing, is this a direct correlation as to any changes?
Interesting. So you do come to some conclusions overall about what it is that tends to make that turn veterans into extremists. And you generally conclude that it's, for the most part, it's the same thing that turns civilians into extremists. Care to explain that a little bit? Are you able to explain that a little bit more? And then maybe do bring in what is unique about being the veterans who have embraced extremist ideologies. Let's go with Frank. Then over to
Yeah.
Dale.
Yeah. So
You guys are very good at deferring to each other. And like
yeah,
to that, I just have
yeah, yeah,
jumped in the second that somebody that I'm done speaking.
right.
So yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, ultimately, you're right. We came up to the conclusion that veterans are very much similar to their civilian counterparts. Like Dale spoke to earlier, there's a really big need now to answer more questions than we started with, because essentially our dive into this gave us a lot more questions than it did answers. And so again, I've spoke to some of the things that we're going to be doing to look into, obviously, getting some demographic information in there, gender, age, uh, even political preference, party preference, ideology, so kind of getting some of those other other things in there to help explain and help get a better idea of these groups and what makes each, more or less extreme. And as we tie those other components in, I think we're going to have a lot bigger picture, a lot fuller picture as we continue on. Um, but unfortunately, it's just stepping through that, bit by bit, and getting to that point of being able to answer those questions. And until then, we can, postulate on on what we have here. But unfortunately, that's about all we can do until we go through the motions and get those numbers.
I like postulate way better than speculate. That's good.
Yeah, it's a great word.
Postulate and ruminate.
Yes.
That's funny. Yeah, I think back to the point I made earlier, what I really took away was the ability for veterans to unite. I think that's what this really showed me was not necessarily do they think any different because the service made them that way, but what the service certainly did for veterans is give them an ability to find like-minded folks and organize accordingly. Um, Now, yes, we've seen examples in the past where these efforts are nefarious, but we've also seen where these efforts work together for a greater good. I immediately think we're at Christmas time. I think of Toys for Tots, and you see these initiatives where veterans come together and they understand that just because my service is over, my oath did not expire, and therefore my ability to take care of my fellow human beings. And although this is looking at U.S. veterans, there's initiatives around the world, the Red Cross. There's so you know, there's the list is so vast. The idea that your service doesn't end, but what it has given you is the ability to come together with those other people who see the world the way you do and make an impact one way or the other. Um, and I think that as we continue to tell this story and we move forward, that will certainly become much more prevalent. We'll see that this is exactly how it plays out.
Right on. Well, gentlemen, I'm going to leave it there in deference of to your both of your times, but thank you very very much for your service, for your continued service, and I'm really looking forward to seeing more that what you guys come up with and what the effect of the state of veterans turns out to be. Where just one last time, where can people find state of veterans stuff, or how can they get in touch with you guys?
We were actually just having a conversation about this earlier today that we need a web presence. It's been something we've been talking about for the last handful of weeks here. We've gotten some base ideas, but unfortunately we don't have a website just yet. Um, Dale, do you know if we have a social media handle? I know Roxana was working on something like that.
Yeah, we are in the process of working all of this out. I believe it's on Instagram. And you have to forgive us, Rob. This when I tell you this is truly a brand new launched initiative, I'm telling you this is brand new. We just did our first webinar, I believe last week. And then we just submitted our paper 2 weeks ago, I believe. Um, and so everything is extremely fresh. And, there is something to be said about striking while the iron's hot. When we realize that there's a there, we jumped all over it. And I think this also goes into our call to action that, we need those folks who see the gap and have the abilities to fill it to please come forward. What I can do is I can give out my email. You can
No,
find
anyways,
me.
here's what we're gonna do. Here's what we're gonna
Yeah.
do. Don't worry about that. I'm gonna have you guys on again in the pretty near future anyway, if if you'll come on, because I'm really interested in seeing what else you guys are able to dig up. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and as soon as you guys are set up online, I mean, let us know, and I'll make sure that I push that out there. In the meantime, you know, look, just keep an eye out for more state of veterans material as they come out.
Right, and you can look up the Clapper Institute, CLAPR at Arizona State University. You'll find Dr. Francisco Pedraza there, and he's the liaison, if you will, for everything state of veterans. So
Wonderful. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thanks for having us on.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.